What's another subtext I wanted to talk about? Varys and Illyrio. Alright, so the code is 10 of clubs, 6 of diamonds, king of spades. For today's discussion, Tyrion has some of the most difficult subtext in the whole story. Maybe Pycelle, because I just read that recently, and I'm trying to make sense of it still. Tower of Joy, maybe? This is the 9 of diamonds. That's good. That's a start. Alright, the code for today's discussion is the 10 of clubs, the 6 of diamonds, the king of spades, and the 9 of diamonds. Such a goofy system. Alright, let me set things up. I have to see this, though. Neato. Hey guys, I'm Apples and Dragons, and this is Grey Sheep and Hedge Wizards, where I talk about A Song of Ice and Fire, like a lunatic. For today's topic, I want to talk about subtext. So I got some passages picked out that have some really interesting subtext. Let's dive in. Subtext is the layer between text and metatext, and it's extremely important, because once you're sure what the right subtext is, then you can treat it almost as literally as text. Which also shifts the mystery games up a layer, where if you're trying to solve a mystery and the subtext hands you an answer, you might want to consider discarding it, depending on how clear that subtext is. Because it might break the practically inviolable rule of stories that the characters in the story will never give you the right answer to the mystery. At least not until they resolve at the end. That's enough preamble. Let's dive in. This is a Game of Thrones. The first book. The first passage is at the 10 of clubs. It's in the chapter that I performed recently. Game of Thrones, Eddard 15. It begins, the straw on the floor stank of urine. There was no window, no bed, not even a slop bucket. So Ned's in the black cells under the Red Keep. King's Landing. He's in prison for treason. Bunch of BS if you ask me. So the first line of the chapter tells me that the cell stinks of urine. It says the straw on the floor stank of urine. And it says there's no window, so the air can't even circulate. And there's no slop bucket to even go to the bathroom in. So he's going to the bathroom on the floor, probably in a corner somewhere. So that's probably why it stinks. And then 3 pages into the chapter, a jailer comes in. The scarecrow of a man with a rat's face and a frayed beard. Clad in a mail shirt and a leather half-cape. No talking, he said as he wrenched the jug from Ned's hands. Please, Ned said. My daughters. The door crashed shut. He blinked as the light vanished, lowered his head to his chest, and curled up on the straw. It no longer stank of urine and shit. It no longer smelled at all. Did you catch the subtext? It says it no longer stank of urine and shit, it no longer smelled at all. Taken literally, it means the smell is gone. The book's literally telling us that the smell is gone. At least you could read it that way if you wanted to. But given the situation, The fact that Ned is locked in a cell with no way out. The fact that there's no window where the smell might escape. The fact that Ned's been down here for several days and that he must have to pee and poop sometime. The fact that he's not bathing every day. And all this context combined makes it completely undisputable that the smell is still there. But what's really happening is that Ned is getting used to the smell because he's been breathing it in every moment of every day for however many weeks he's been down here. And that's what happens when you're stuck with a smell for a long time. Your senses get used to it and you don't smell it anymore. So the subtext is that effect is in play. And that's why, quote, it no longer smelled at all. Ned just got used to the smell is all that happened. The smell's still definitely there. It's kind of gross when Varys comes to visit and he's wearing his beard disguise. And Ned reaches up and touches his face. When I read that, I was like, oh my god. Varys, don't let him touch your face. Sorry, Ned. And so, subtext is a tricky animal because you can get caught in really stupid arguments about one person's taken the text way too literally, saying, look, it literally says the smell is gone. And then ignoring the context that obviously changes the meaning, changes that literal interpretation undisputably to something completely different, where the smell is actually still there. It just means that Ned's getting used to it. And this story in particular, A Song of Ice and Fire, really loves to play with a given body of text capacity to accommodate more than one subtextual reading. And that's why I started with this example, because it's really simple and it's really undisputable. Like the reading that the smell literally went away and it's no longer there, and that like when Varys comes, he doesn't smell it. Holds no water whatsoever, not even a drop of it. Because based on the cell, there's no way for the smell to escape. And based on the way smell works, there's no way for the smell to escape. And there's like 1,000 different ways you can prove that reading is nonsense. Let's go to the next one. And it happens really early on. I'm looking for the 6 of diamonds here. It's in a Bran chapter. Here it is. Bran 2. It's where he finds Jaime Lannister and Cersei Lannister at the top of the broken tower in Winterfell having sex. Having incest sex. And he overhears their conversation. And overheard conversations in this story are generally some of the story's most difficult subtextual puzzles. I'm going to read it and then we'll talk about it. Bran was moving from gargoyle to gargoyle with the ease of long practice when he heard the voices. He was so startled he almost lost his grip. The first keep had been empty all his life. "I do not like it," a woman was saying. There was a row of windows beneath him, and the voice was drifting out of the last window on this side. "You should be the hand." "Gods forbid," a man's voice replied lazily. "It's not an honor I'd want. There's far too much work involved." Bran hung, listening, suddenly afraid to go on. They might glimpse his feet if he tried to swing by. "Don't you see the danger this puts us in?" the woman said. "Robert loves the man like a brother." "Robert can barely stomach his brothers. Not that I blame him. Stannis would be enough to give anyone indigestion." "Don't play the fool. Stannis and Renly are one thing, and Eddard Stark is quite another. Robert will listen to Stark. Damn them both. I should have insisted that he name you, but I was certain Stark would refuse him." "We ought to count ourselves fortunate," the man said. "The king might as easily have named one of his brothers, or even Littlefinger, God's help us. Give me honorable enemies rather than ambitious ones, and I'll sleep more easily by night. They were talking about father, Bran realized. He wanted to hear more. A few more feet, but they would see him if he swung out in front of the window. We will have to watch him carefully, the woman said. I would sooner watch you, the man said. He sounded bored. Come back here. Lord Eddard has never taken any interest in anything that happened south of the Neck, the woman said. Never. I tell you, he means to move against us. Why else would he leave the seat of his power? 100 reasons. Duty, honor. He yearns to write his name large across the book of history. To get away from his wife, or both. Perhaps he just wants to be warm for once in his life. His wife is Lady Erin's sister. It's a wonder Lysa was not here to greet us with her accusations. Bran looked down. There was a narrow ledge beneath the window, only a few inches wide. He tried to lower himself toward it. Too far. He would never reach. You fret too much. Lysa Arryn is a frightened cow. That frightened cow shared Jon Arryn's bed. If she knew anything, she would have gone to Robert before she fled King's Landing. When he had already agreed to foster that weakling son of hers at Casterly Rock? I think not. She knew the boy's life would be hostage to her silence. She may grow bolder now that he's safe atop the Eyrie. Mothers. The man made the words sound like a curse. I think birthing does something to your minds. You are all mad. He laughed. It was a bitter sound. Let Lady Arryn grow as bold as she likes. Whatever she knows, whatever she thinks she knows, she has no proof. He paused a moment. Or does she? Do you think the king will require proof? The woman said. I tell you, he loves me not. And whose fault is that, sweet sister? Bran studied the ledge. He could drop down. It was too narrow to land on, but if he could catch hold as he fell past, pull himself up. Except that might make a noise, draw him to the window. He was not sure what he was hearing, but he knew it was not meant for his ears. You are as blind as Robert, the woman was saying. If you mean I see the same thing, yes, the man said. I see a man who would sooner die than betray his king. He betrayed one already, or have you forgotten? The woman said. Oh, I don't deny he's loyal to Robert. That's obvious. What happens when Robert dies and Joff takes the throne? And the sooner that comes to pass, the safer we'll all be. My husband grows more restless every day. Having Stark beside him will only make him worse. He's still in love with the sister, the insipid little dead 16-year-old. How long till he decides to put me aside for some new Lyanna? Bran was suddenly very frightened. He wanted nothing so much as to go back the way he had come, to find his brothers. Only what would he tell them? He had to get closer, Bran realized. He had to see who was talking. The man sighed. You should think less about the future and more about the pleasures at hand. Stop that, the woman said. Bran heard the sudden slap of flesh on flesh, then the man's laughter. Bran pulled himself up, climbed over the gargoyle, crawled out onto the roof. This was the easy way. He moved across the roof to the next gargoyle, right above the window of the room where they were talking. All this talk is getting very tiresome, sister, the man said. Come here and be quiet. Bran sat astride the gargoyle, tightened his legs around it, and swung himself around, upside down. He hung by his legs and slowly stretched his head down toward the window. The world looked strange upside down. A courtyard swam dizzily below him, its stones still wet with melted snow. Okay, that's enough. So the conversation begins with Cersei saying, "I do not like it. You should be the hand." So apparently Cersei knows that Robert has asked Ned to be the hand of the king. And she doesn't like it. She thinks Jaime should be the hand. Jaime says, "Gods forbid. It's not an honor I'd want. There's far too much work involved." So far, everything's pretty direct. There's not a lot of room for subtext. "Don't you see the danger this puts us in?" the woman said. "Robert loves the man like a brother." So at this stage of the story, we don't know that Joffrey's a bastard yet. This is the first scene that suggests that Cersei and Jaime have an incestuous relationship. And then from that you can deduce that maybe Cersei's children are bastards. But at this stage of the story, we're still pretty new to all of the characters. And this is really the first time Jaime and Cersei are on screen talking and showing us their personalities and stuff. A first-time reader is not likely to consider what their incestuous relationship means for Cersei's children, and what all the implications of that might be. Cersei doesn't like that Ned is becoming the hand of the king, and she thinks it should be Jaime. And Jaime doesn't want to be the hand of the king because there's too much work involved. Which might at first seem like an excuse Jaime is using to disguise his real reason for not wanting to be hand. But once we learn more about Jaime, we can see that actually that is his real reason. He's the kind of guy who will skirt responsibility in order to pursue his own self-gratifications. Cersei says, "Don't you see the danger this puts us in? Robert loves the man like a brother." The man seems to be referring to the hand that she was talking about earlier. And I think that's right. But it's important to stop and consider whether the subjects actually match up. We've already seen that Robert and Ned have a close friendship, very similar to brothers. So Ned being the man Cersei's talking about matches with Cersei's comment that Robert loves the man like a brother. But she also says, "Don't you see the danger this puts us in?" So Ned becoming hand puts them in danger somehow. And there's a little room for interpretation about the us. Us must at least include Cersei and Jaime. But upon consideration of her children's bastardy, it might also include her children, Joffrey, Myrcella, and Tommen. And Cersei's meaning with the word us might actually be referring to Cersei and Jaime's whole family, biological family, where it's Cersei, Jaime, Joffrey, Myrcella, and Tommen. And upon even further consideration, the us might actually include the entire Lannister family. Because if Robert were to find out that his children are bastards, he might likely have them all killed for treason, and the Lannisters removed from power and replaced with some other house. So in that interpretation, the us includes Cersei, Jaime, Joffrey, Myrcella, Tommen, Tywin Lannister, Tyrion Lannister, Kevin Lannister, on and on, right? The whole Lannister family. But then I can consider that Cersei's actually a pretty selfish person. And if she cared about her family that much, she probably would have put a stop to the incest and the bastard production sooner. And her meaning with the word us is probably only referring to herself, Jaime, and their biological children, Joffrey, Myrcella, and Tommen. Jaime says, "Robert can barely stomach his brothers. Not that I blame him. Stannis would be enough to give anyone indigestion." So according to Jaime, Robert doesn't like his brothers, and neither does Jaime. Particularly, Jaime doesn't like Stannis. And considering Stannis' personality, which we learn about later, we can come back to this passage and see what Jaime means about the indigestion comment. Stannis is lacking in social graces. He's serious and stern and grumpy and resentful and just unpleasant to be around in general. Contrasted with Renly, who's kind of a jokester and playful and has a good sense of humor, a little ostentatious, probably more fun to be around. There's not a lot of subtext in this line, so I'm going to move on. Cersei says, "Don't play the fool. Stannis and Renly are one thing, and Eddard Stark is quite another. Robert will listen to Stark. Damn them both. I should have insisted that he name you, but I was certain Stark would refuse him. So when Cersei says don't play the fool, she thinks Jaime is playing dumb, that he doesn't notice that Ned Stark being the Hand of the King is worse than Stannis or Renly being the Hand of the King. And this matches with Ned Stark's reputation as a very honorable and honest man. Where Renly might be willing to abide the lies and deceit that is required to keep Cersei's secret, Ned would not be. And where Renly might have some dirt on him that Cersei or Jaime could use to leverage against Renly to force him into silence about her children's bastardy and the incest between Jaime and Cersei, Ned does not. Or if he does, it isn't obvious what it might be. Where Stannis is resentful and contemptuous of his brother Robert and Renly and his family in general and his situation, and where Cersei and Jaime might be able to play that resentment against Robert in order to protect the secret that Cersei and Jaime are in an incestuous relationship and that Robert's children are bastards, Ned Stark does not have those resentments or that contempt. So I think Cersei is right that Ned being Hand is a more dangerous situation for her and Jaime and their kids than either Stannis or Renly being Hand. She says Robert will listen to Stark. Damn them both. So the resentment and contempt goes both ways. Robert's contempt and resentment for Stannis and Renly would actually prevent him from taking their advice. And those are resentments and contempt that's absent in Robert's relationship with Ned. So Robert would be more willing to listen to Ned. Jaime says, we ought to count ourselves fortunate. The king might as easily have named one of his brothers, or even Littlefinger, God's help us. Give me honorable enemies rather than ambitious ones, and I'll sleep more easily by night. And this is when Bran realizes that they're talking about Ned. It says they were talking about father, Bran realized. He wanted to hear more. The subtext there is that Ned being Bran's father is the reason he wanted to hear more. You can imagine that it's possible to get into an argument about somebody who's particularly blind and deaf to subtext, where they insist that Bran wanting to hear more has no relationship whatsoever with the topic that Jaime and Cersei are talking about being his father, Ned Stark. Even though that's clearly the implication when you put those two sentences side by side. It's another simple, almost silly example, like the first one, about the smell in Ned's prison cell. But our tendency to extract a third meaning from two meanings that are placed side by side is a feature of the human mind that this story takes great advantage of to hide its deeper meanings and the answers to its mysteries. And so just practicing our ability to recognize and distinguishing which meanings are literally in the text and which meanings we're extracting from it. It's a crucial skill with this story. And it's something that we're going to want to always be aware of as we're reading it and analyzing it. I'm going to jump ahead a little bit. Cersei says, his wife is Lady Erin's sister. It's a wonder Lysa was not here to greet us with her accusations. So his is referring to Ned. Wife is referring to Catelyn, because Catelyn is Lysa Arryn's sister. And she says it's a wonder Lysa was not here to greet us with her accusations. The implications of that line are huge. It means that, at least according to Cersei, Lysa has accusations to make of Cersei. And considering that Cersei's having sex with Jaime right now, and that all three of her children are bastards, and that if anybody finds out, they're in big, big trouble, the accusations that Cersei's referring to seem like they're probably those. Which means that, at least according to Cersei, Lysa knows that Cersei's children are bastards. And so, from this line, if you're paying close enough attention, it's actually possible to extract the right question that you need to ask. In the Jon Arryn murder mystery, most of what does the work in the story of preventing the reader from getting the right answer to that mystery early on is that the characters are asking the wrong questions. None of them are asking what Lysa's motivations were. They take it on faith that Lysa's message to Catelyn is genuine. And no wonder. Lysa's Catelyn's sister. If you can't trust your own sister, who can you trust? Or in Ned's case, if you can't trust your sister-in-law, who can you trust? If the premise of Cersei's comment is correct, that Lysa does have accusations to greet Cersei and Jaime with at Winterfell, and if those accusations are about the bastardy of her children and the incestuous relationship between Cersei and Jaime, then one question we can ask ourselves is, why isn't Lysa here? Why did she go back to the Eyrie instead of to Winterfell? Or heck, another question is, why did Lysa even leave King's Landing in the first place? Why not just go straight to the king with it? I'm going to jump ahead to what I think is the most intriguing subtext in this whole interaction. Jaime says, "Let Lady Arryn grow as bold as she likes. Whatever she knows, whatever she thinks she knows, she has no proof." He paused a moment. Or does she? "Do you think the king will require proof?" the woman said. "I tell you, he loves me not." Did you notice that Cersei didn't actually answer the question? She answered Jaime's question with another question. "Do you think the king will require proof?" "I tell you, he loves me not." And then she makes it an issue of love. Jaime's question was not about whether Robert loves Cersei. The question was, does Lysa Arryn have proof of their incest or the bastardy of Joffrey, Myrcella, and Tommen? So Cersei is deflecting the question and not actually answering it. And the subtext of that, one potential subtext of that, could be that Lysa Arryn does actually have proof. And Cersei knows it. And that's why she's so freaked out that Lysa Arryn might have been here at Winterfell to greet us with her accusations. And so you can imagine from Cersei's point of view, it's actually really weird that she's not here. And maybe Cersei was wondering what Lysa Arryn's up to. And of course, Lysa's got her own plans. Lysa's still in love with Littlefinger. She resents her marriage to Jon Arryn because he's so much older than her. And because her father made her basically abort Littlefinger's baby. So from Lysa's point of view, when Jon Arryn confides in her, maybe even in bed, like Cersei suggests, that the king's children are bastards of incest between Cersei and Jaime, Lysa saw an opportunity in it to kill Jon Arryn with poison and frame the Lannisters for it by sending a letter to the Starks, her sister Catelyn. Or maybe Littlefinger saw the opportunity in it and just helped Lysa towards it. Most of what makes this Jaime and Cersei passage difficult is that it happens so early in the story, before the reader has a good foothold on who all of these characters are, what the relationships are between them, what the titles and terminologies are in this story. And the story's nature as a mystery story, as much if not more so than a fantasy story. Because the story requires that the reader question the motivations of the characters in it, even when they're motivations of characters we've never even met yet, like Lysa Arryn. So after you're familiar with the story and you've been engaged with it for a long time, the subtext of this passage isn't so difficult. But it's, for a first-time reader, it's almost unapproachable. On page 90 of 5,000-ish. The next passage I wanted to look at is a doozy. This one is in an Arya chapter, where Arya's in the tunnels beneath the Red Keep. And then she overhears a conversation between two mysterious figures who are almost certainly Varys and Illyrio. Their shadows writhed against the sides of the well, tall as giants. "Found one bastard," one said. The rest will come soon. A day, 2 days, a fortnight. And when he learns the truth, what will he do? A second voice asked in the liquid accents of the free cities. The gods alone know, the first voice said. Arya could see a wisp of gray smoke drifting up off the torch, writhing like a snake as it rose. The fools tried to kill his son, and what's worse, they made a mummer's farce of it. He's not a man to put that aside. I warn you, the wolf and lion will soon be at each other's throats, whether we will it or no. Too soon, too soon, the voice with the accent complained. What good is war now? We are not ready. Delay. As well bid me stop time. Do you take me for a wizard? The other chuckled. No less. Flames licked at the cold air. The tall shadows were almost on top of her. An instant later, the man holding the torch climbed into her sight, his companion beside him. Arya crept back away from the well, dropped to her stomach, and flattened herself against the wall. She held her breath as the men reached the top of the steps. What would you have me do? Asked the torchbearer, a stout man in a leather half-cape. Even in heavy boots, his feet seemed to glide soundlessly over the ground. A round, scarred face and a stubble of dark beard showed under his steel cap, and he wore mail over boiled leather, and a dirk and short sword at his belt. It seemed to Arya there was something oddly familiar about him. If one hand can die, why not a second? Replied the man with the accent and the forked yellow beard. We have danced the dance before, my friend. He was no one Arya had ever seen before. She was certain of it. Grossly fat, yet he seemed to walk lightly, carrying his weight on the balls of his feet as a water dancer might. His rings glimmered in the torchlight, red gold and pale silver, crusted with rubies, sapphires, slitted yellow tiger eyes. Every finger wore a ring, some had two. Before is not now, and this hand is not the other, the scarred man said, as they stepped out into the hall. Still as stone, Arya told herself, quiet as a shadow. Blinded by the blaze of their own torch, they did not see her pressed flat against the stone, only a few feet away. Perhaps so, the forked beard replied, pausing to catch his breath after the long climb. Nonetheless, we must have time. The princess is with child. The Khal will not bestir himself until his son is born. You know how they are, these savages. The man with the torch pushed at something. Arya heard a deep rumbling. A huge slab of rock, red in the torchlight, slid down out of the ceiling with a resounding crash that almost made her cry out. Where the entry to the well had been was nothing but stone, solid and unbroken. If he does not bestir himself soon, it may be too late, the stout man in the steel cap said. This is no longer a game for 2 players, if ever it was. Stannis Baratheon and Lysa Arryn have fled beyond my reach, and the whispers say they are gathering swords around them. The Knight of Flowers writes Highgarden, urging his lord father to send his sister to court. The girl is a maid of 14, sweet and beautiful and tractable, and Lord Renly and Sir Loras intend that Robert should bed her, wed her, and make a new queen. Littlefinger, the gods only know what game Littlefinger is playing, yet Lord Stark's the one who troubles my sleep. He has the bastard, he has the book, and soon enough he'll have the truth. And now his wife has abducted Tyrion Lannister, thanks to Tyrion's meddling. Lord Tywin will take that for an outrage, and Jaime has a queer affection for the imp. If the Lannisters move north, that will bring the Tullys in as well. Delay, you say? Make haste, I reply. Even the finest of jugglers cannot keep 100 balls in the air forever. You are more than a juggler, old friend. You are a true sorcerer. All I ask is that you work your magic a while longer." They started down the hall in the direction Arya had come, past the room with the monsters. "What I can do, I will," the one with the torch said softly. "I must have gold, and another 50 birds." She let them get a long way ahead, then went creeping after them, quiet as a shadow. "So many?" The voices were fainter as the light dwindled ahead of her. "The ones you need are hard to find. So young to know their letters. Perhaps older, not die so easy." "No, the younger are safer. Treat them gently." "If they kept their tongues." "The risk." Long after their voices had faded away, Arya could still see the light of the torch, a smoking star that bid her follow. That's a really cool passage. I'm mostly interested in the ending of it. Varys is the master of whisperers. Whenever somebody asks him how he knows something that he can't possibly know or shouldn't be able to know, he sometimes answers that little birds told him, or he has little birds. And this conversation implies that the little birds are children. They're human children. Which is sort of the implication in the saying, "a little bird told me." The person is protecting the informant by putting the blame on the forest creature. And he's sort of comically making little to no effort to make the lie believable. Because, of course, birds don't talk. And so, birds not being able to talk is sort of the essence of the comedy in that saying, "a little bird told me." And the essence that the audience tends to extract from this conversation, the subtextual essence, is that the same thing is going on with the children here. They're not able to talk, or in other words, their tongues are being cut out. If their tongues really are cut out, and Varys is either the one doing it or the one responsible for it, then Varys is unambiguously a villain. Cutting out people's tongues is pretty high on the list, and then cutting out the tongues of children is even higher. And the almost unanimous interpretation of this back and forth here about the little birds is that Varys is urging Illyrio to cut out the children's tongues so that they'll be better secret keepers and better tools for Varys to use as the master of whispers, basically. Now, I can't really convey ellipses in my reading of it, but if you get the book open and look at this passage, you'll see a whole bunch of ellipses everywhere. I guess I can show you some of it. Maybe it'll show up. If they kept their tongues, the risk. They're just completely surrounded by ellipses, the dots. And throughout this story, those dots represent something missing. In other words, this isn't the full sentence. The risk is just part of a sentence that had some stuff before it and some stuff after it. But it's actually worse than that. Because since this whole story is written from the point of view of the POV character of the chapter, the dots also represent there may or may not be something before this, and there may or may not be something after this. In other words, the words "the risk" in this particular line might be the beginning or the end of the sentence. So we actually have almost no clue what was actually being said here. But there are some clues that help us figure out who's speaking at any given line. And the first ones are given right at the beginning of this conversation. Arya notices some identifying features of the two men, and we have to track those in order to tell who is talking at any given line. The first identifying feature is that one voice has an accent, the liquid accent of the free cities. That's Illyrio. So whenever the voice is said to have an accent, we can be sure that's Illyrio. The next identifying feature is, "What would you have me do?" asked the torchbearer. So one man is holding a torch. A stout man in a leather half-cape. Even in heavy boots, his feet seemed to glide soundlessly over the ground. A round, scarred face and a stubble of dark beard showed under his steel cap, and he wore mail over boiled leather, and a dirk and short sword at his belt. It seemed to Arya there was something oddly familiar about him. So that is a boatload of identifying features, and it's actually enough to be absolutely certain that this is Varys, for a number of reasons. It makes sense that Varys would be oddly familiar to Arya, Arya living in the Red Keep, and probably having seen Varys before, if not met him before. His feet seemed to glide soundlessly over the ground. This is another recurring characteristic of Varys. Even his disguise, stout in a leather half-cape with a stubble of dark beard and a steel cap, mail and boiled leather, is a very similar disguise to the one that he wears in that Eddard chapter when he visits Ned in the dungeons of the Red Keep. He also speaks softly, and that's another characteristic of Varys. So there's no question that this is Varys. There are more identifying features, but we already have the one we need, is that Varys is the one holding the torch. And then we can go back to the end of the conversation and apply that knowledge. "What I can do, I will," the one with the torch said softly. "I must have gold, and another 50 birds. So this is the man with the torch speaking. So that whole paragraph is Varys. And there are some other rules about the way the story is written that you have to know in order to decipher this conversation. One rule is that all dialogue happens within quotes. Everybody knows that rule. That's easy. But another rule is that when a paragraph with quotes is followed by another paragraph with quotes, it can be one of two things. Either a new person is speaking, or the same person is speaking about a new topic. And as I say it, you're probably thinking to yourself, yeah, that's confused me before, where there were two consecutive paragraphs in quotes, and I wasn't sure if it was a new person speaking or the same person speaking about a new topic. So think about it. In those situations, how do you tell the difference? What do? You could look for a line that has somebody's name in it, but not all of them have somebody's name in it. So you still need a way to resolve the confusion. What you probably do is this. The way you resolve the confusion is you look at the meaning of what the first speaker said, and then you look at the meaning of what the second speaker said, and if what the second speaker said logically follows as a response from what the first speaker said, then the degree to which it makes sense as a response is the degree of certainty you can have that that's a different speaker. So far, we've got a good handful of methods to tell at any given line who is speaking. We've got a bunch of identifying characteristics. We've got the meanings of what's actually being said. When it's a response, we can assume that it's a different speaker, because it usually doesn't make sense for somebody to respond to themselves. We've got new paragraph with quotes must mean either new speaker or same speaker, new topic. But there are even more methods than that. The two characters are talking about whether or not to cut out the tongues of their little birds or children spies. And every time one of them responds to the other with words that seem to fit with that topic, then we can assume consistency of topic between lines. And as long as the topic seems to be staying consistent, we can mostly safely rule out the possibility that a new line means the same speaker talking about a new topic. So let's read through it again and label the lines based on who's speaking. "What I can do, I will," the one with the torch said softly. I must have gold and another 50 birds. So the one with the torch who's speaking softly, both of those characteristics describe Varys. So that paragraph is Varys speaking. Then there's a paragraph where nobody's speaking, it's just Arya sneaking around. Then there's a paragraph that says, so many. The voices were fainter as the light dwindled ahead of her. The ones you need are hard to find, so young to know their letters, perhaps older, not die so easy. There are no identifying characteristics in that paragraph, but since there obviously hasn't been a topic change, it must be a different speaker. And since the last paragraph was Varys, this one must be Illyrio. Then it says, no, the younger are safer, treat them gently. Again, there are no identifying characteristics to help us out here. But since the topic seems to be staying consistent, I can be reasonably certain that the new paragraph break can only mean that there's a new person speaking. And since there are only two people in the conversation, that must be Varys. Then there's another paragraph break. If they kept their tongues, must be Illyrio. The risk must be Varys. So now that we know who's speaking at every given line, there's one more thing in the content of what they're saying that helps us fill in a lot of the missing information with reasonable certainty. Varys is requesting from Illyrio more gold and another 50 birds. Then Illyrio says, so many. So apparently Illyrio is objecting either to how many coins Varys wants or how many birds Varys wants. And since Varys didn't say how many coins he wants, he only said how many birds he wants, Illyrio's so many must be in reference to the birds, not the coins. And that's made clearer when Illyrio says, so young to know their letters. Perhaps older, not die so easy. The younger are safer, ... treat them gently, ... So far we have Varys makes a request, Illyrio objects to the request and makes some modifications to it. He wants the children to be older. Then Varys rejects the changes. In other words, at the end of their conversation here, they're apparently having a disagreement. And in the context of a disagreement, Illyrio is the one who's suggesting cutting out their tongues. And Varys is arguing against it. And so Varys' line, the risk, is probably Varys pointing out the risks of cutting out their tongues to argue against cutting out their tongues. And Varys' line, the younger are safer, treat them gently, is probably the same thing. What's so cool about the end of this conversation is that it plays on the human tendency to overestimate the value of the information that we have and to underestimate the value of the information that we don't have. The words that are obscured by the dots. Additionally, it plays on the reader's tendency to imagine relationships between two things that are side by side, causing them to overlook simple rules like a new paragraph means a new speaker, especially in the context of an argument where the topic is consistent, causing us to read if they kept their tongues the risk as the same speaker. And then when you think about the practicalities of being a spy master and having in your service a bunch of children who sort of sneak around, crawl into small spaces, and read people's letters and bring the information back to Varys, to make your spies as easily identifiable as simply grabbing the child and prying open its mouth to see whether or not it has a tongue is so obviously a stupid thing for a spy master to do to his spies that they can't possibly be what Varys is doing or arguing for it. And that the only reason Illyrio is arguing for it is because Illyrio lives in Essos, where the cutting out of tongues is a lot more common, because in Essos there's a lot more slavery, unlike Westeros, where slavery is forbidden. And so you can see that the ways that the characters see the world differently shine through in the interpretation by rewarding the reader for taking into account those differences rather than just ignoring them and assuming that everybody sees the world the same way. And even more than that, you can discredit the possibility that Varys wants to cut out the children's tongues by considering Varys' sentence fragment so young to know their letters. Varys' concern is that it's hard to find children who are so young and who know how to read. So one implication of that line is that they need their spies to know how to read, which makes sense for Varys' spies because the way Varys uses his spies is that he sends children to read other people's letters and then come back and read them to him. Varys describes that that's the way he does spying in a much later chapter when he's talking about his time in Myr. So this comment from Illyrio, so young to know their letters, shows that Illyrio knows that Varys needs his spies to know their letters, which strongly suggests that Varys needs his spies to know their letters. And if Varys' children's spies know their letters, then cutting out their tongues would not actually protect the spy master from their betrayal. Because any child who wants to betray the spy master could simply write out the information. What I love about this whole passage is that the almost unanimous interpretation in the audience about what's going on in it is that Varys wants to, is, or does cut out the tongues of children. But when you pay close attention to the rules of the text and the way it's structured, and the subtext of what's actually being said, you can see that the audience is completely wrong. It's actually Varys who's arguing against cutting out their tongues. Which means that he probably doesn't cut out children's tongues and probably never has. And then you can consider that in the context of Varys' backstory, where he was mutilated as a child. So it makes a lot of sense that somebody who was mutilated as a child would be adamantly against mutilating children. And then if you wanted to, you could go through the story looking at Varys' spies to see if there's ever a time when we can see whether or not they have a tongue. And what you find when you do that is that you never do get to see whether or not the children have a tongue. The children simply never talk. But as we can see in characters like Wex Pike, not talking is not the same thing as not having a tongue. And then you can see how this interpretation lines up with the story's implicit criticism of the reader for overlooking or disregarding the points of view of the common people. Because in the interpretation that Varys is cutting out the children's tongues, we underestimated the children, supposing that they're not capable of staying quiet when instructed to. Let's move to an earlier part of this conversation, because there's a cool subtext going on with the Hand of the King. Too soon, too soon. What good is war now? We are not ready. Delay. That's Illyrio. As well bid me stop time. Do you take me for a wizard? No less. What would you have me do? If one hand can die, why not a second? Replied the man with the accent and the forked yellow beard. You have danced the dance before, my friend. He was no one Arya had ever seen before. She was certain of it. Before is not now, and this hand is not the other, the scarred man said as they stepped out into the hall. Perhaps so. The first time you read this, you're probably thinking that the hand they're talking about is Jon Arryn, because the mystery of who murdered Jon Arryn is at the forefront in the Game of Thrones. So when Illyrio says, if one hand can die, why not a second? We interpret the word die literally, because Jon Arryn literally died. So if Jon Arryn is the hand who died, then the second hand, who Illyrio is suggesting be killed, appears to be Ned Stark, because Ned Stark is the new Hand of the King at this stage of the story. And then Illyrio says, you have danced the dance before, my friend. And that line implicates Varys as either the murderer of Jon Arryn or being a part of the murder of Jon Arryn. But the dance this dance before, my friend line is kind of out of place here. If the hand Illyrio is referring to is Jon Arryn and the second hand is Ned Stark. Because it isn't so clear how murdering people is a dance. I mean, I guess you don't want to get caught, and maybe your attempts to not get caught are a dance. But describing cold-blooded murders as a dance just doesn't seem to fit in some ways, does it? Then you might suppose that maybe the hands are not who they seem to be. We can be sure that the first hand he's referring to is dead, and the second hand he's referring to is alive. So maybe the first hand he's referring to was either not Jon Arryn, and the second one is still Ned, or maybe the second hand he's referring to is not Ned, and the first one is still Jon Arryn. Considering that they were just talking about Ned a moment ago, the interpretation we're likely to come away with, even while we're challenging our first interpretation of this line, is that the second hand Illyrio is referring to must be Ned, because they were just talking about Ned. And so it's the first hand who must be different than who we originally thought it was. What if the first hand wasn't Jon Arryn? What if the hand that Varys killed or helped kill was a hand before Jon Arryn? You can already see the subtext of this line beginning to morph as you're thinking about it. And it isn't until 4 books later, in A Dance with Dragons, that the transformation of the subtext of this line is completed. Let me find that passage real quick. The Lost Lord, A Dance with Dragons, page 306. Page 311. The men of the Golden Company were outside their tents, dicing, drinking, and swatting away flies. Griff wondered how many of them knew who he was. Few enough. 12 years is a long time. Even the men who'd ridden with him might not recognize the exile Lord Jon Connington, of the fiery red beard, in the lined, clean-shaved face and dyed blue hair of the sellsword Griff. So far as most of them were concerned, Jon Connington had drunk himself to death in lice, after being driven from the company in disgrace for stealing from the war chest. The shame of the lie still stuck in his craw, but Varys had insisted it was necessary. "We want no songs about the gallant exile," the eunuch had tittered, in that mincing voice of his. "Those who die heroic deaths are long remembered, thieves and drunks and cravens soon forgotten." What does a eunuch know of a man's honor? Griff had gone along with the spider's scheme for the boy's sake, but that did not mean he liked it any better. "Let me live long enough to see the boy sit the Iron Throne, and Varys will pay for that slight and so much more. Then we'll see who's soon forgotten." Jon Connington was the hand of the king of Aerys Targaryen. One of several, but a hand nevertheless. And so that line in A Game of Thrones, when Illyrio says, if one hand can die, why not the other? The death is symbolic, not literal. Varys saved Jon Connington's life after the war was lost, and spirited him away to Essos in exile, ostensibly so that he can serve Varys' purposes later. And so when Illyrio says, if one hand can die, why not a second? He's not suggesting that Varys literally killed Ned. He's suggesting that Varys saved Ned's life by sending him away to Essos in exile, to be reused later. That's a very cool passage for subtext. Anyway, that's all the time I have right now. I think that was a good first dive into the subtext of A Song of Ice and Fire. We saw a good range of complexity and difficulty, and got a good feel for some of the mechanics of the story's mysteries. Anyway, thanks for coming, guys. It was fun. I hope you got something out of it, and I'll see you next time.